When your Game Awards show is so uninteresting, the only part people remember isn't even related to games.
Hey, Matan. You know, real quick, I want to thank everybody and say that I think I want to nominate this award to my Reformed Orthodox Rabbi, Bill Clinton. Thank you, everybody.
All right, well...
You are coping and seething.
2022 was a bit of a weird year for me. It had a few games that I was really interested in, but there was also a lot of meh. I finally got access to internet speeds that aren't absolute trash, and later got myself a VPN, meaning I was able to try out a lot more games that I wouldn't normally take a risk on, if you know what I mean. And despite saving a lot of money in that regard, there were a lot of very disappointing games from this year, with most of my game time taken up by things that came out in the past instead. So if it wasn't for my newfound Seven Seas voyage, this video would have probably been a lot shorter than last year's, just saying. So yeah, these are all games that launched in 2022. No early access stuff. Some games will only be considered as honorable mentions if I haven't beaten them or if they are remasters or DLC. And I will insert them into the list between other entries where they would have ranked otherwise, same as I did last year. Let's get it on! What do you get when you combine Stardew Valley, Rune Factory, and an Atelier game? Something right up my alley, right?
Well, you're wrong.
Unfortunately, you get probably the most boring game in this wheelhouse, Potion Permit. This game takes elements from each of those series that I mentioned and makes them boring, tedious, uninteresting, and pathetically easy. In fact, I can't think of a single thing about this game that stands out beyond being mediocre. What this game is supposed to be is a life sim JRPG where you are a chemist who can create potions for the people of Moonberry, who are all very wary of your presence as an outsider, and treat their medical ailments whenever they pop up to build trust within the community. It's a slow burn type of game, but the way they designed it means you won't be doing that for most of the game. At the start, you are very limited, and in order to upgrade your tools to be able to do more, and also to progress the main story and unlock other places to explore, you will be spending the vast majority of your time harvesting a metric fuck-ton of wood and stone. Yep, they took the worst part of Rune Factory and slapped it into this game as the main activity for some reason. As for the alchemy that was clearly ripped off from the Atelier games, as well as the other mini-games you have to do to diagnose and research, there's no depth or challenge to it whatsoever. There are other activities to do as well, such as increasing your friendship levels with the townsfolk and eventually romance one of them, which I hated doing because the only character I liked was one who only showed up in story events. Or you could go fishing, which I also hate doing in any game because fuck fishing, and the game glitched out and wouldn't let me fish for the rest of my save file anyway. And you can also take random jobs for a bit of extra money, which is also just tedious. There's literally nothing interesting this game does. Even if all you want is a relaxing, brainless, easy game to kill time with, there are better games like this out there. So last year I said I went on a bit of a Metroidvania spree, and it technically never ended, so you'll see a few of those on this list too. First we have Komaju Remilia Scarlet Symphony, which actually isn't a Metroidvania. I really wish people knew what genre definitions really are when tagging stuff, because I went into this expecting a Symphony of the Night inspired game, but it was really a Castlevania 4 or Dracula X style game, meaning linear stages, very few abilities to gather throughout the game, difficult bosses with a set number of lives, and no actual exploration. See, when you call a game a Metroidvania, it needs to have the Metroid part of it too, where you have an open 2D zone that unlocks as you progress through the game, otherwise it isn't a Metroidvania. Castlevania 4, Dracula X, and this game are not Metroidvanias. Anyway, enough of that. Komaju Remilia Scarlet Symphony is a classicvania set in the Toho universe, a series that I have avoided for a long time because I'm not into shoot-'em-ups, where you play as an edgy version of Reimu and fight through various stages of Remilia's castle full of undead, monster, and fairy enemies. And, well, honestly it's not that interesting to be honest. The levels tend to repeat themselves quite a bit, making getting through this game a test of patience more than anything, as it will trip you up if you try to rush things, and if you die 3 times, you get sent back to the beginning of the stage. I know some arcade boomers are going to call me a filthy casual or whatever, but I'm over this shit at this point. I don't want this kind of archaic design to come back, it just makes games less enjoyable. All that aside, however, the game is pretty to look at, with a pixel art style very similar to Symphony of the Night, and when you do get to the bosses, they are pretty satisfying to take down. But you have to be patient because of the bullet hell elements they've carried over from the shoot 'em up games, otherwise you'll just get sent back to the beginning of the stage again. This game may appeal to you more than it did to me, so if you wanted a successor to the original style of Castlevania, it may be worth checking out. Summon Night? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, the Summon Night series hasn't exactly sold very well, so I wouldn't be surprised if it slipped under many RPG fans' radars. It doesn't really help that the first game in this series we got was a spin-off released on the Game Boy Advance in 2006, when the system was already pretty much dead. Summon Night Swordcraft Story 1 and 2 managed to become very niche cult hits though, and left some of us wanting more. Unfortunately, the third game never came out in the West, and after that, the series kinda slowed down production while the developers at Felis Stella made other things, one of which we'll get into later. But in 2022, 16 whole-ass years later, we get a spiritual successor to Summon Night Swordcraft Story called Maglim Lord. The story of this game is pretty similar to the Summon Night series, except this time you play from the perspective of a fallen demon lord, with allies of the other races, 2 humans, a machine, a demi-human, and a spiritual being. Your main character was once a very powerful being, fighting against the almighty gods of the universe, but something happened that put a stop to it. But you can't recall what happened, as you find yourself in a bizarre sort of utopia run by a ruling corporate-like administration that you now have to work for, alongside some unlikely allies, while you figure out what's really going on. The game doesn't take itself very seriously though, so cartoony characters and tropes will carry the story, which is fine. You spend a lot of the game in pretty lengthy visual novelesque cutscenes and optional dialogue sequences building relationships and goofy romance with the characters of your choosing, which will give you different endings and events. If all this sounds nice to you, there is one thing you need to really be aware of before getting into this game. The gameplay is very, very bad. Like, damn. There are only a small handful of overworld areas to explore that are recycled for every single side mission, forcing you to retread ground over and over again if you want to keep up your equipment and stats. And they all look straight out of the PS2. And the battle system feels like it was ripped right out of the Game Boy Advance Summon Night games, except they somehow made it worse, with an actually useless dodge mechanic, only 2 combos per weapon with weird hit lag every time you attack, and exploitable jank that can let you breeze through the game if done correctly. Not to say I didn't have any fun with it at all, because I did, or perhaps it was just the longing for a new Swordcraft story game speaking, who knows. It's quite unfortunate the game turned out this poorly, and hopefully they can make a proper revival sometime in the future. Continuing on from my non-Metroidvania point, we have Everblade. Although this time the game does have its fair share of Metroidvania elements, it's not entirely one. Everblade is a retro 2D action platformer about a no-name villager that takes up arms against a dark mage that destroys his home. It's a fairly simple story, with subtle lore that can be discovered throughout the game. I would compare it to the NES Mega Man games in terms of the way it plays, with various themed obstacle course stages full of wall jumping that you go through, but with special abilities such as the grappler or different elements that you unlock as the game progresses that allows you to unlock hidden areas in previous stages. It's also quite comparable to Shovel Knight in terms of level design, as well as the abundance of treasure out there for you to find. Additionally, this game has some pretty awesome bosses that require a bit of practice to get down. I think fans of those 2 games I mentioned as well as Metroidvanias will feel right at home playing this one, but there are a few things that hold it back. For one, the controls are very slippery, and for some reason the control stick on my Switch Pro controller I was using doesn't work properly with this game. You are supposed to point in one of 8 directions to throw your throwing knives, with the same stick or control pad you use to move, making it very easy to make a lot of mistakes, and that leads to why I'm only considering this otherwise pretty good game an honorable mention. I can't beat it. The last boss was designed in a way that requires extreme precision, with aerial knife throwing and grappling, and I just can't do it without making a billion mistakes because the control issues make it much harder than it should be. Oh well. Check it out if you're feeling brave. So you know how we call certain games Souls-like now, when they have traits similar to Dark Souls? Well, I propose we start calling certain games Ori-likes. Artistic platformer and Metroidvania games that look and sound better than they actually play. That's Itora in a nutshell. An absolutely beautiful Aztec and Mayan-inspired Metroidvania. If that sounds right up your alley like it was for me, pump the brakes a bit and I'll explain. Itora is about a young girl who awakens in the jungle with no recollection of what happened and finds her way into a pit of dark spiders. There she meets the talking axe that can't remember much of anything either, and hey nice, another non-sword protagonist. Anyway, it's up to you to team up with the tribe of jungle furries and find out what's going on in this world that's under threat from a mysterious otherworldly plague. The story actually turned out pretty interesting, and it could possibly be even more fleshed out if they make a second game. The music was pretty wild too, with old native instruments mixed with modern genres of music. However, though the game excelled in style, it was frustrating to play for various reasons. Not that it was super difficult or anything, but there were a few design flaws throughout the game. For one, there are missable treasures in one area, and one area only, but the game does not communicate this at all. If you miss anything in other regions, there's no way to know which area has them. And if you decide you want to go find them, have fun because there's no fast travel or overworld map at all, with many regions being designed in a very linear way, and getting around can be a hassle in itself because the game's controls are whack. Like having a stamina meter that depletes with sprinting, with your default speed in the air being very slow, but wall jumping defaults to sprint speed. It's weird and made me screw up a lot, especially with those irritating chase sequences, another thing clearly ripped off from Ori. But unlike Ori, this game's combat has some issues that really take some getting used to. As a large axe wielder, naturally, many of your attacks take some time to pull off, and combined with quick platforming and dodging means some things just don't work right. I've seen attacks go straight through enemies doing nothing, and even some enemy attacks going straight through me, and some attacks got cancelled due to walking off a platform or something, but still hit the enemies anyway with invisible hitboxes. I mean, as a Smash player, this is nothing new to me, just saying. But it gets annoying sometimes, and really is only alleviated by the game being fairly easy. I really wish this game turned out better because it has a lot going for it with its art style and theme, so I hope they can improve upon it for whatever they decide to do next. Continuing the trend of utterly derivative retro-inspired games, we have Blossom Tales 2. Both of these games are basically clones of A Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, so if you get these games, you know exactly what to expect. The twist on these games is that the story is told by an old grandpa narrator to his two grandkids, Lily and Chris, about the exploits of a heroine named Lily in a magical kingdom, and in the second game, she must rescue her brother Chris from the Minotaur King. The best thing about the story being told this way is that you have several moments in each game where the kids will argue about what happens next, and you, the player, get to choose what happens. It's usually a fairly insignificant point, but still amusing. But the real question is, how does it hold up in comparison to games like A Link to the Past? It's hard to say, actually. For one, A Link to the Past is far from my favorite Zelda game, which is unlike most longtime Zelda fans as far as I know. Blossom Tales 1 and 2 both have significantly fewer dungeons than most Zelda games, but they make up for it in quality and design, especially with the second game. They're fairly intricately designed, and each one has a bit of originality that sets it apart from the ones we've seen in Zelda, and I was pretty impressed. The pixel art and music are great, it makes you feel right at home with this game. It even has native Switch Pro controller support, just saying. However, the game falls short in other areas, such as its short length and tedious side activities, further exacerbated in the second game by feeling a lot more slow in general than the first one, especially with everything being tied to a stamina meter, including your roll, which is the only way to move faster, and very limited fast travel spots. The slow movement really hampers the combat as well, making projectile-based enemies massively more dangerous compared to the rest. These are minor issues I had, so I still enjoyed the game quite a lot regardless. If you've got a 2D Zelda itch, this series is worth picking up. This This next game swept the internet for a while, and while everyone seemed very enamored with it, I found it to be just fine. Stray, the cat simulator with a dedicated meow button. I mean, you can't really go wrong. But aside from that, I thought actually playing it was kind of boring in quite a few places. Fortunately, you do have a pretty well-crafted and interesting environment to run around in, with a story that was a bit surprising at times, though nothing groundbreaking. The sort of post-apocalyptic and post-cyberpunk setting is designed very well, and the game is nice to look at in general. The cat very much controls and behaves like a real cat, and you can complete it in about 4 hours unless you want to find everything. There's really not a lot else to say about this one. If you want to play as a cat or want a casual game to distract yourself with, and for some reason haven't played it yet, go for it. If you watched my Top Games of 2021 video, you may remember me mentioning Pokemon Legends Arceus. It looked like a step towards the Pokemon game I've always wanted, but also looked very ugly. Well, I got my hands on it, and damn, it's consistently very ugly. The entire overworld looks like it came from a PS2 game, which is unfortunate because being able to hunt and catch Pokemon freely in a rich and interesting overworld is what I think will make the series great again, and this game can be considered a step in that direction. However, it's clearly obvious where the game's inspiration comes from: Zelda Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade Chronicles. The mechanics inspired by both of these games aren't nearly as good or polished as their original counterparts, such as the stealth, which is incredibly shallow and exploitable once you know that literally every Pokemon behaves in the same simple way, and the alpha Pokemon, which are similar to the unique monsters or tyrants from Xenoblade, are not nearly as intimidating once you know how they work. All that being said though, I had a ton of fun playing the game. Playing Pokemon Shield for myself after playing Legends Arceus really put everything into perspective. Unlike the main series, which is a tedious guided slog most of the time, this game is not that, and everything is much more fast-paced unless you go out and explore and do things the way you want, to a degree. You get your starter, and then have a lot more Pokemon available to choose from to make your team even in the first large area you visit, which there are 5 of, so each area you unlock gives you even more options fairly early on. That is, if you aren't like me and spent too much time exploring around like I always do. I was pretty overleveled by the time I got to every story boss, so I can't attest to the game's actual difficulty, but some of the bosses are pretty intense. If you go into this game expecting a masterpiece, you may be let down, but if you were like me who was sick of the same game with a new skin suit every other year, you may enjoy it. I hope Scarlet and Violet would take notes from this game's strengths, and it looks like that may be the case to some extent, but, well... Another year, another Atelier game, but this time we got something a little unexpected. I thought we would be getting the 3rd entry in the Ryza series, but instead we got Atelier Sophie 2, The Alchemist and the Mysterious Dream, which takes place in between Atelier Sophie 1 and Atelier Firis. This one tells the story of Sophie's journey after the events of the first game that was previously left up to the imagination. And speaking of imagination, the story begins with Sophie and her partner Plakta getting sucked into a dream world, created by the goddess Elvira after stumbling across a mysterious magical tree in the woods, and that's where the entire game takes place. Now, Sophie 1 was a very mediocre game in my opinion, so I went into this one with abyssal expectations, but I came out pleasantly surprised. The story was told fairly well with some mildly interesting twists and turns. Nothing too extraordinary, but it has some nice moments for anyone who grew attached to the characters in the first game. They brought back the puzzle-like alchemy system from the Mysterious Trilogy, which I didn't care for, but they managed to iron out all the annoying problems with it in this one via upgradable catalysts that give you a lot more freedom the further you progress, and require so much less tedious trial and error. The turn-based battle system is passable, pretty on par with other games in the series, but at least they gave us the option to speed up the animations this time. The out-of-combat exploration is where I felt the game had the most interesting ideas, with the climate switching devices you get throughout the story, with a lot of other mechanics borrowed from Atelier Ryza and put to good use, such as the way you gather materials. Ever since they began using this game engine that I think started with Atelier Lulua, everything Gust makes looks very pretty and runs very well even on the Switch. What holds this game and pretty much every Atelier game back for me is that every time I play one of these games, even though I enjoy them, it just feels like going through the motions yet again. I like JRPGs and I like alchemy and crafting systems, but the payoff is unremarkable. I really wish they would take more time to flesh out the stories and lore in these games, rather than making everything about the somewhat shallow characters and their petty interactions with each other. And maybe don't go and poop out a new one every year like it's Call of Frickin' Duty. So when I talked about Magnum Lord, I mentioned there were other things the developers had been working on, and the next game is one of those, and oh man is it spicy. Pull up your bootstraps and grab your jars of dirt because this is probably the lewdest game on the list this year, 7 Pirates H. Now this is one of those games that technically has been around for a while, but it only came out in Japan on the Vita back in 2016. Now it got a re-release on the Switch worldwide, and probably would never get approved by Sony these days. After all, the H in the title, well, you can probably guess what it means. 7 Pirates H is about Parut, a young pirate gal who is knocked overboard and washes ashore on an island in the Monsupi Sea, where she is the only human among monster girls, strange monsters that look very sus, the cute but weird tit-head tribe called the Boobykin, and the hyper-perverted monster boy Otten, who wants nothing more than to touch all the titty he can get his flippers on. Yep, this is not a game you are meant to take seriously. Parut's main goal is to gather as much treasure as she can, and becomes focused on the magical compass she has that points to the 7 treasures that are placed inside it. Along the way, she gathers a motley crew of Monster Girl pirates that make up your party in this fairly typical JRPG. There's really not a lot to say about this game except the way you level up, which is... shit, can I even show this on YouTube? I don't know. But basically by Otten's suggestion, you become stronger via booby training, which basically lets you play with your character's tits via the Switch's touchscreen or your control sticks. Doing this also modifies your character's physical breast parameters, such as bigger for higher attack or smaller for higher agility, more or less softness for higher HP or defense, among other things. It's pretty ridiculous. They turned titty jiggle physics into an integral stat mechanic. Never change, Japan. That said, there were some frustrating elements to this game, such as being fairly repetitive even though it's not very long, and I had one game crash making me lose 2 hours of progress near the end since there was no autosave. At least the game wasn't very long for an RPG, but yeah, it's definitely a low-budget gimmicky title that you shouldn't have high expectations of in the first place. Unless you just want to play with anime titties. Then you get what you expected.
あんたはマジで許さない。これが私の伝説だよ。やられちゃった。立ち止まっていられないよ。
Let's talk about Rune Factory 5. Ooh, strap yourselves in for this one, lads, because we're going to be here for a while. I know I was while playing it. Although I have to admit, despite how much I enjoyed it and how high I'm placing it on the list, I let a lot of negative things slide. Very negative things. So, Rune Factory 5 is a long-awaited sequel to Rune Factory 4, which came out almost a decade ago on the 3DS, and the developer went bankrupt afterwards. This game didn't even get greenlit until the Nintendo Switch's sales were confirmed to be strong, and then it suffered agonizing delays and issues that still plagued the game after release, such as, the game runs like absolute ass. Walking through the game's main town of Rigbarth drops the frame rate to a slideshow, especially if a lot of characters are walking around on screen. To make things worse, you'll be fast traveling from place to place a lot, meaning lots of loading screens that are much longer than they should be, with your surroundings popping in as you finally get going. It's inexcusable that a game runs this badly while looking like a PS2 port, even on the Switch, which was the only system it was available on when I got it. And not to mention, it's been out in Japan for quite a while. You'd think they would have had some fixes ready to go by the time we got it, but no. Apparently, the localizers at Xseed thought the most important thing to do was shoehorn same-sex relationships rather than actually fixing all the game's numerous problems, even begging and pleading to get the Japanese creators to do it as well before they released it here. Anyway, despite all the issues and despite crashing on me multiple times, it's still a very enjoyable game. If you don't know, Rune Factory is basically Harvest Moon but with action RPG gameplay as well. You'll balance out each day between tending your farms, socializing with townfolk, building relationships, gathering ingredients, cooking and crafting, while also adventuring into the various wild regions and dungeons throughout the main story. You start out as someone with no memory, cliché, I know, who finds themselves magically transported to the town of Rigbarth. There you meet Captain Livia of the Seed Organization, which is like a guild of sorts. Maybe more like a police force, I don't know. But you basically unravel the story by taking part in their missions around the region. The story isn't all that special, and socializing with the characters every day was something that always felt like a chore to me. Unlike the actual chores, such as farming and crafting, is what I would spend most of the time doing because I love management sims and stuff like that. So you get to do all that, then use the materials you gain to create weapons, armor, tools, food, potions, and accessories customized to your whims, and then use them to succeed in your adventures and destroy your enemies. That's why this series is so appealing to me. And if that sounds appealing to you, then you should not try this game.
What?
Yeah, I would actually recommend playing Rune Factory 4 instead, which is also on the Switch. Or you can get it on the 3DS if you're a weirdo. That game has all the same appeal without all the technical difficulties. The only thing different is that Rune Factory 5 is in full 3D, while 4 is a top-down sort of thing. And that may sound like a game changer, but it really isn't, because they designed this game to be pretty much more of the same, with tons of things from the previous games carrying over into this one. And I have to say, it doesn't work well in this game's favor a lot of the time, especially the more tedious elements feeling much slower due to the game's technical issues. For example, random tree stumps and large boulders magically appearing in your farms for you to have to manually destroy over and over and over again. Or having to run errands in town, but everything is so much more spread out and time consuming just to get to certain places. Like going to the store to buy flour and rice, because you still can't grow your own goddamn wheat or rice, but you can grow bok choy, which is a completely useless crop until very late in the game where you finally get the one and only recipe that uses it. Or how I had to waste time every day farming the same materials over and over to raise my skill level to get the next piece of equipment that would let me survive more than 3 hits. Then immediately afterwards got an overpowered piece of armor from a random chest. Then by the end of the game had a weapon so powerful that the last boss went down in 5 seconds. There's a lot of glaring omissions from the recipe list as well, but we'd be here all day. This series has a lot of room to improve on many aspects, including the combat, which is very archaic and unbalanced, and the environments, which are incredibly ugly. I know I'm being very harsh, but it's still a very fun game. It's one of those games where you say, okay, I gotta go to bed after 10 more minutes because it's almost midnight, and the next thing you know, the sun is going down the next day. I got my hands on it while I was unemployed, and that's probably a good thing because my sleep schedule got completely destroyed. I just couldn't put the damn game down. Even through the rage-inducing crashes that made me lose around an hour of progress each time, I still wanted to keep playing. Until, of course, the game crashed as I entered the last floor of the post-game dungeon. At that point, I said fuck it. My poor Switch took a beating with this one, and I didn't even get to experience the romance bullshit that the goddamn localizers think is so goddamn important when I can't even bother to keep goddamn playing because it keeps goddamn crashing. I do hope they improve the series after this with a better gameplay experience and hopefully evolve the series past its old quirks, and maybe ditch Xseed. They're a lost cause. The series is starting to sell fairly well now, so we'll see what happens, but as always, my expectations will be the lowest.
And there it is!
Our favorite sexy librarian, god-killing, Smash 4 destroying witch is back, baby. Bayonetta 3 is as ridiculous and chaotic as ever, packed to the brim with absurd shark-jumping action in every single chapter that there's never a dull moment. Even the beginning, you see Bayonetta 1 Bayonetta fighting a large strange being and actually getting killed, which was a surprising thing to see off the bat, and Viola, a bratty punk witch in training, is sent to another dimension to find Bayonetta again. That's when the main antagonists that destroyed Bayonetta's world show up and start to wreak havoc in Bayonetta 3's world. Yep, they went the multiverse route with this story, and it's honestly pretty retarded. But the story isn't really the main attraction of the series. Bayonetta's combat is fun as fuck, and has a surprising amount of customization available. Without spoiling too much, each time you go into another dimension and find another alt-dimension Bayonetta, you get to use her weapon. So there are a ton of them available throughout the game, my favorite being a razor yo-yo-like thing. You also get to use Viola, who has a completely different playstyle, and Jeanne, who has her own special kind of stages. The gameplay never gets dull, and in addition to that, each stage has a ton of exploration and hidden secrets throughout, as well as a surprising amount of environmental interaction and destruction that keeps each stage very interesting. The game also has tons of little references and nods to other IPs, including Sonic Adventure, Terminator, Cowboy Bebop, and some of the gameplay took inspiration from Nier Automata, which is nice. But there are things that really hold this game back. They still have the button mesh and QuickTime events, which isn't surprising, but I've always hated these things. Some combat parts against large enemies can get really messy due to the camera moving inside of them, or automatically turn around to where you can't see anything, only to get slapped by attacks that you can't see. You can change the camera distance, but it will still be an issue against the biggest enemies. Another issue throughout the whole game is the Switch itself. The hardware doesn't do these character models justice, and some of the environments are pretty ugly with a lot of pop-in and other distracting graphical annoyances. These are just nitpicks compared to the biggest issue I have with the game, Viola. And no, it's not the more obvious aspects that I see people whining about. I didn't mind her design. In fact, she did grow on me more as the game went on, even though she's treated like a slapstick clown that fills a similar role Enzo does for much of the story, getting dunked on repeatedly in hilarious ways. The problem is when you finally take control of her in Chapter 5. Her playstyle is garbage, really frustrating, has no variation like Bayonetta does, and it's like trying to control a character that's out of place and obviously not who the game was designed for. I could go into more detail, but long story short, using her after the third time make me say fuck it, and I stopped giving a shit about completing side missions and challenges and just rushed through the rest of the game, which ended in a way that Viola's haters will really not like, just saying. I don't know if the series will have a successful future after this if they decide to continue it. There's been a lot of drama surrounding this game, and most of it is inane Twitter outrage bullshit. Best to put all that to the side and just go into it with an open mind if you want to play it yourself. I still enjoyed it for what it offers, and you probably will too if you enjoyed Bayonetta 1 and 2. It's been 10 years. 10 years since the first Xenoblade Chronicles arrived in the West. 10 years since I got myself hooked playing it and its predecessors, resulting in the reignition of my love for video games. And now, here we are in 2022 with the third entry in this saga, and I just feel tired. Lately I've been questioning if it's just me and not the game that's the problem, while everybody else is hyping their lives away. I've played so many different games at this point, but then I remember how much I loved Riftbreaker in 2021, and Sakuna in 2020, and Dragon Quest Builders 2 in 2019, or how I've been loving The Legend of Heroes in general. Considering how much I love the first Xenoblade, this one shouldn't have me so drained, and yet, here we are. It can't just be me. What I'm about to say may be considered mild spoilers, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear it. Xenoblade 3 is a very unhappy game. That in itself I don't have an issue with. In fact, the absence of plucky shonen bullshit that plagued Xenoblade 2 was very welcome. Don't get me started on that. It felt like the writers were not only going in the complete opposite direction of 2, but also heavily projecting their dismay towards the world and aspects of humanity in this game, as if they are becoming cynical old curmudgeons trying to write a story for edgy 14-year-olds. Tetsuya Takahashi specifically, who I know is capable of writing excellent stories, and at times, it felt like this game was a return to form for him, but then later parts of the game fell apart, showing that it was just wearing pieces of a Xenogears skin suit. I don't want to get too specific here, as you should see for yourself, and heck, maybe I am way off base here, but there really was only one thing I wanted this story to do, and it didn't do it. Bias aside, I probably won't be alone in saying, the villains really fucking suck. Which is kind of a series first, but this game is full of one-dimensional villains that look evil, say evil things and do evil things without any justification or understandable motivation, and spend way too much time monologuing so that your characters can preach and virtue signal at them before they fight, barely showing their faces or backstory so they can be dehumanized as much as possible when it's time to kill them, so you won't feel bad doing so. With some exceptions, of course. But overall, they are an absolute clown show. As for the rest of the cast, they are fine, I guess. Honestly, none of them really stand out as interesting, so that leaves me with Yuni, Riku, and Minata as my favorites due to simply being the funniest characters. well, at least the voice cast carried them, as Xenoblade's British voice acting shines through again. Well, the main cast is good except for Senna, but there are voices in the supporting and side cast that are utterly atrocious. And let's not forget all the ridiculous fake curse words they made up for the script. Come on guys, the series is old, the fans are old. Stop trying to stoop to the rating board's meaningless standards and say what you mean. Anyway, let's get into the game itself. The game combines various mechanics from Xenoblade 1 and 2, which is a real treat to see it all working together, including your party, allowing you to have 6 party members plus 1 guest at a time on the field, making battle a very busy and hectic thing to behold. It certainly takes some getting used to. Unfortunately, in order to get there, you have to slog through the beginning where you only have 3 people. And holy shit, is it slow and boring. Try getting through this part on the game's hard mode, I dare you. I lost my patience with it. Otherwise, once you have all 6 members, the game really gets going, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. Despite the fact that, similar to Xenoblade 2, this game doesn't really respect your time. For example, tedious, unskippable animated tutorials for self-explanatory menu features, or the way certain quests require info gathering from NPCs that aren't marked on the map sometimes, and having to go back to a rest spot just to progress in many areas, or the fact that the game arbitrarily locks so many basic mechanics behind story progression that would have made things a lot quicker if you had them sooner. My favorite part of the game was the exploration and design of the world, with a lot of references from Xenoblade 1 and 2, including Torna, some very obvious, others very subtle and only noticeable to those who have played both games. Unlocking and discovering the out-of-the-way hidden secrets in this game was a big part of my enjoyment, though getting a lot of them requires slogging through the tedious side quests, which there are a fuck ton of. I didn't do all of them, but I still finished the game around 130 hours. And if you spend a lot of time doing them, you're going to be greatly overleveled, making the game too easy and you'll be unable to unlock points for ranking up your character's classes. My recommendation is this: if you don't want to do the side quests, use the bonus EXP at rest spots like in Xenoblade 2. But if you do want to do a lot of side quests, don't use the bonus EXP, and you'll probably find yourself at a proper level for most of the game to retain some of its challenge, and you'll have more options available to you. But whether you do that or not, there is still one more problem. Your characters being able to switch to any class is cool in terms of having a lot of customization options, but it removes their uniqueness in battle and makes the entire game's combat feel repetitive after 100 whole ass hours of it, since you are doing the same things with each character, using the same builds and strategies throughout the entire game because it just works. So, it was kinda hard to decide where this game lands. I was considered making a dedicated video about it, but once I beat it, I lost the motivation to do so, and I'd rather not get into why that is due to it being heavy spoiler related. I'd still say I liked the game overall, more than 2 at least, but there are some aspects that severely hold it back. In terms of performance, it was kind of impressive considering the low specs of the Switch and the amount of chaos going on in-game at any given time. The game looks nice for a handheld, and there's some technical wizardry going on to keep this game's frame rate at a somewhat playable state. It did crash on me twice, however, and there were some worrying stutters every now and then, but I never really lost much progress due to the autosave. This game is a prime example of why we need a new Switch model. Just saying.
Wamba.
So close to making it.
In my Best of 2021 video, go watch it if you haven't, while talking about Metallic Child, I said that I was never really interested in the roguelike or roguelite genres, because it sometimes felt like the elements of those games were just used to artificially inflate the game's difficulty and length. Well, things change, I guess. Or rather, as things change, they all remain the same, because another roguelite charmed its way into my life with its cute protagonist in the form of Little Noah, Scion of Paradise. This game is an action platformer almost entirely carried by its unique combat system, and I had quite a lot of fun with it. You are Noah, a young alchemist on an airship who gets caught in a storm after a mysterious cat hops on board and crashes near some mysterious ruins. Driven by curiosity and a need for parts to repair her ship, she enters the ruins to find the cat once again, as well as a dark figure causing a disturbance in the area. The story is pretty simple, but not really the main draw. While exploring the ruins, you'll come across various monsters called Lilliputs, which when collected can be put into one of 5 different normal attack combo slots or one of 2 powerful skill slots that have a cooldown period. Each one has its own unique attack animation, speed and range, and a special skill that can have a wide area of effect or special characteristics. Mixing and matching the 5 normal attacks was the most interesting and fun part of the game for me, as you can create some wild combos like launching them into the air, spiking them into the ground, knocking them away, then grabbing them to pull back towards you for a finisher. I loved it, but sometimes the action can get pretty chaotic where it's hard to see where Noah is at and you get hit by sneaky attacks. Throughout your run of the dungeons, you'll get tons of upgrades to your attributes, and if you die, everything you've collected gets converted into mana, which can be used to repair the ship, which will give you permanent upgrades and unlock other features that'll help you before you get back into the ruins. But, because this is a roguelite, a lot of what I said about Metallic Child holds true for this one, and I have to question whether or not it would be better if it wasn't a roguelite. There's a lot of randomization that can really screw you over, like not getting the Lilliputs or upgrades you actually need. When you die, you have to start over from the first room. This makes the game feel longer than it really is, which is quite short, as there are only 3 main zones to get through. So from start to finish without dying, the game is less than 2 hours long. Fortunately, the variation and experimentation in the combat makes having to redo everything a lot less painful because the game remains fun much longer than the game's actual length. The other thing that holds it back is a lack of variation in the stages themselves. If you die a lot, you'll be seeing a lot of the same room layouts over and over again, and while there are some optional branching paths in the ruins, they really only change the looks and some of the enemies within for one stage. There are a lot of mechanics in this game that could be expanded upon to make something truly incredible, and I hope it happens. You do get a to be continued message at the end after all. Just add keyboard support to the PC version next time. I mean, come on. Nope, not talking about this game this year. Okay, I have to be fair, I know, so I'll keep it short. This time, things are a bit different, because unlike last year's focus on Inazuma, a region I found to be kind of boring at the end of the day, due to me being tired of Japan themes because I play too many Japanese games, I guess. This year we got Sumeru, a region inspired by India and the Middle East, and damn, I fucking loved this update. I love the architecture of places like that, and love seeing their inspiration in fantasy settings. I actually started getting into the main story quest this time, whereas before, I was dying for a skip cutscene function. Not only was it brilliantly put together, it also featured the new best Archon in the game, just saying. And later on, they added a highly addictive trading card game that I've been enjoying more than I thought I would. To wrap it up, still loving this game despite the bullshit, and despite the retarded fan base. Keep it up, Hoyo. Still not buying your rip-off shit though. Over $20 for a skin?
No.
Okay, so this next game is a weird one, for me at least. I had a hard time deciding where to put it on the list for various reasons. For one, it's a PC point-and-click adventure game, a genre I have almost no history with. The only one I remember beating was SpongeBob Employee of the Month, a cheap CD-ROM game back in the day, so I don't know how to rate these kinds of games in the first place. Second, trying to figure out this game took me a lot longer than it probably would for the nerds who've been playing these types of games since the 90s. And I am ashamed to admit I had to look up the answers once to get past one part, but hey, at least it was only once. Third, I am heavily biased towards this game because it was made by a YouTuber I love, the dapper and ever so charming Top Hats and Champagne.
Cheers, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Top Hats and No Brain.
Born Punk, a game I want to heap praise on and shill it as much as I can, I really do. But I have to be fair, if you can easily get past the moon logic that is required to figure out the game's puzzles, it will be fairly short. The upside is that it looks like there may be multiple ways to get through certain parts of the game. Can't entirely confirm it now because I only played it once, but if true, it will have some replay value. Another issue I had was that I glitched into a wall at one point, and if I hadn't saved before it, I could have permanently locked my save file and had to start over. Other than that, I really loved what I played. Despite its very serious and dark cyberpunk setting, it's a very humorous game with a cast of very outrageous characters, including your three protagonists: Evie, an alcoholic hacker and perpetual fuck-up; Flash, a normally gentlemanly android who adopted the persona of a 1990s rapper; and Mariposa, the CEO of a very large conglomerate, and probably the most normal person of the cast, but with a pinch of psychopathic tendencies. Eventually, these three will be brought together by three bizarre entities occupying their minds that also want to be brought together in the digital space. Or so it seems. It's a cyberpunk story, so you never know what will really happen. The game is very funny and very cleverly written with very good voice acting considering it was done mainly by non-professionals, including other content creators. Evie and Flash had me laughing quite a bit, just saying. Just be aware that some of the script is very much laced with internet humor and real-world references, so if that's not your thing, well, now you know. It looks like there may be more coming out of this story based on the ending, so I do hope to see the characters and this setting again.
Man, why you doing like that? We a gang! Not if you were the last Sandro in the world. Ah, compadres, always up for a joke. I know you like me. I know they like me.
2022 was a year that introduced a lot of people to Souls-like games, for better or worse, and I'm no exception, though I was initially put off by the style of game due to its reputation of being tediously difficult. I tried a demo of Nioh back in the day, and I was so terribly pathetically awful at it that I gave up before I even finished the demo, just saying. So what came out in 2022 that got me into this style of game? The answer is obvious. Just like how Metallic Child got me into trying out roguelikes, just give me a cute protagonist and I'm interested. Yep, it's not Elden Ring, it's Little Witch Nobeta.
That's the cutest fucking thing I've ever seen in my entire.
This game is about Nobeta's journey through a dark and dreary castle, full of evil spirits and remnants of an old kingdom led by a talking black cat with the goal of leading her to the throne. Much of the story is shrouded in mystery and pretty minimal, with a few hints left behind by some of the hidden items scattered throughout. It does a pretty good job at environmental storytelling, and the music was very good and fit the setting very well. The main focus of games like this is obviously the gameplay, and I had quite a lot of fun with it. Nobeta is a spellcaster, meaning her playstyle is going to be different than most, focusing on ranged combat, charging her spells to give her augmented abilities, and unleash more powerful versions of her ranged attacks. You can move, attack, and dodge while your spell charges up, meaning you have a lot more leeway than it may seem at first, with some mechanics you'll have to discover on your own if you want to play it, as gradually learning the more advanced ins and outs of combat is part of what made it so fun. Though this game does a very poor job at explaining what even the most basic functions do sometimes. Throw in some badly designed puzzles and you have a recipe for frustration in ways that maybe the developers didn't intend. Another issue is that a lot of the environment looks very samey in each area, and there's no map, so expect to get lost every now and then. When I talked about Blue Fire last year, that game had a similar issue, but in that game, each area remained very distinct and unique throughout, so getting lost wasn't as likely despite the zones being much larger. Nobeta having smaller areas also means that the game is fairly short, so experienced Souls fans will probably beat it in less than 10 hours. I died a lot, so I played it for around 19 hours. But I don't know if I'd call the game super difficult. It's probably a perfect entry-level Souls-like game, fairly challenging, cute, and fun. Just pretend the developer's Twitter timeline doesn't exist, just saying.
Excuse me, sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back. We can't have this sort of smut being shown online.
Gentlemen. Got it. Shit.
The Rift Breaker. If you want to know how good this game really is, go watch my top 18-ish games of 2021 video. For this honorable mention, I'll keep it brief, as they released an expansion DLC this year called Metal Terror. Basically, it adds a new story segment and sub-biome to explore that's been taken over by sentient alien technology, and there's definitely something weird going on. When I found out about it, it made me want to play through the entire game again. Twice. On the hardest difficulty. Yep, go check out the demo. You won't regret it. But more importantly, go check out my video. My fellow goats. If you don't know, music is second to gaming for me. So when a game takes some awesome music and weaves it into a game in an interesting way, I'm all over it. Especially heavy metal. Yep, it's Metal Hellsinger, a game where you play as a reawakened demon and her skull companion who narrates the story, set out to triumph over the Red Judge, a powerful entity presiding over hell. And to do that, you will rip and tear. Okay, maybe not quite like that, but it's definitely part of the game's inspiration. Here you have to do everything, shoot, slash, and execute your hellish enemies to the beat of heavy metal songs, or get penalized for going off beat. Finally, I could put my rock band skills to use once more, I thought. But no, it's a totally different beast. In fact, I was very bad at it. But I couldn't get enough of it, until my hands began cramping at least. So it took me a few days to get through it as I could only do it well in short bursts before I started to die a lot. But that's okay. It just meant I could enjoy it longer, I guess. But let's talk about the main draw, the music. The entire game was created by Two Feathers, a duo of composers who have done various other video games in the past, and their work in this game is brilliant. Every song fits the theme of the game perfectly, and it's a huge motivating factor to not only complete the game, but also do it well, as you will only hear parts of each song until you get your hit streak multiplier higher, up to 16 times, where the vocals kick in with some guest vocalists you may recognize if you're even a casual metal fan. There were some I didn't know though, but it didn't stop me from wanting to enjoy their performance as much as possible at each stage because they all kick it out of the park. The end of the game, which by the way has a very surprising yet fitting guest vocalist for the last boss that any fan should recognize. They set up the game for a part 2, and I can't fucking wait. That said, there are a couple of places I want the game to improve upon. As a huge fan of progressive rock and metal, I would love to see more songs with varying time signatures and tempos, and not just for personal bias reasons. Despite the music being unique for each stage, you are still doing the same thing to a consistently steady beat in every single stage, making the gameplay variation lacking outside of your choice of weapon loadout. Also, all of the bosses are very similar to each other, which is unfortunate, as a wider variety of insane bosses would make the game so much more epic. Aside from that, there were some parts where the music gets quieter than the action and it threw me off a few times, especially on the 4th level. I'd say that's just a minor nitpick though, and probably just my fault for being a scrub. It's also a bit on the shorter side, but there are extra challenges, a scoring system, and a brutal mode to make it very replayable. I can't sing this game's praises enough. Go get it now. Also, my favorite song is probably the first stage after the tutorial, with Michael Stana of Dark Tranquillity. That guy did the most vocal work for this game, and if you haven't heard Dark Tranquillity before, go listen to their album Atoma. You won't regret it.
This is the end. We're cold stricken to the core. Eternal winter has come. Come fear the one who will ruin this bottomless domain. Dead tombs and frozen stone. Demons collide. Insanely ready with a cause. Dissonance evangelize the place. Chaos, unbound, freedoms of damnation, devour and conquer all.
We're here at number 2, and we still aren't done talking about derivative pixel art games. But this time, we got one that takes an old series formula and innovates and improves on it so much that it's shocking how good it is. Freedom Planet 2. Oh, where do I even begin? Well, for one, it and its prequel are very obviously inspired by classic Sonic games, but they have their own special design to them that makes them feel like completely different games. Freedom Planet follows the main character Lilac and her band of friends trying to save the world of Avalice from whatever's threatening it, and the second game takes place a few years after the first one, with events of the first game resulting in the unsealing of a very dangerous adversary. I don't want to give away too much, as the story in these games is surprisingly good, with many twists and surprising moments made possible by a well thought out and detailed backstory that reveals itself throughout the game. As for the game itself, it's very Sonic. But it's also hard to compare with the classic Sonic games because Freedom Planet has a much greater emphasis on combat, which is the main thing that makes it feel unique and not so derivative. You have multiple characters and each one has their own ways of battling enemies and the challenging and frantic bosses. There's never a dull moment in these games, and every stage is amazingly crafted with beautiful pixel art, some of the best I've ever seen in a game like this, to be honest. And it never ceased to be impressive in the 15 hours it took me to get through it, which is much longer than any other game in its lane. It's hard to find any actual things to criticize with Freedom Planet 2, which is such a massive step up from the first game. I'm still finding it kinda hard to believe. There was one difficulty spike of a boss that I struggled with despite being in the first half of the game, so your mileage may vary on how difficult of a time you have with it, but you will also be able to buy power-up items that give you an edge before each stage. The only other thing I can think of, except my Switch Pro controller technical issues I had with the PC version, is that I wish these type of platformers would use the entire screen's real estate more often, as one of the most annoying things about classic Sonic is getting slapped by an off-screen enemy because you can't see it coming. We have high resolutions as a bare minimum standard now, but this still happens in Freedom Planet 2. Though it does zoom out in certain parts of stages. I wish it was designed entirely around that view instead, so going supersonic speed didn't feel like such a risk when much of the game is designed for you to do just that. But that's just a minor nitpick in an otherwise amazingly inspired and innovative retro platformer. The only reason it isn't number one is simply down to how much enjoyment I got out of it compared to the next game.
Cyclone!
Or rather, the next two games. I'll explain in a bit. But first, let me tell you why this game is so high on the list. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a Souls fan. I thought the gameplay would be tedious and annoying, but Elden Ring is designed in such a brilliant way that if you're finding the game tedious, it's your own fault. Because this game has a giant, beautiful, and diverse open world that allows you to go wherever you want, finding upgrades, items, and abilities that will aid you on your journey. In a way, it felt like the good old nostalgic days of playing the Elder Scrolls again, but with a much better combat system that has so many options at your disposal, it almost never feels repetitive. But unlike games like the Elder Scrolls, the game doesn't hold your hand at all, and you're left to figure out the story and what your actual goal is on your own. I started out with a bandit class character, who used a dagger to land quick attacks as often as possible to take down enemies, and he eventually evolved into a tanky, high stamina, agile warrior, able to block and withstand many attacks while bashing enemies in the face with a magically buffed Morning Star, one of my favorite medieval weapons. It was awesome finally being able to use one of these weapons without feeling like I was being gimped by not using a fucking sword this time, as it was very satisfying being able to knock even the largest enemies and bosses down after a bit of perseverance and several power strikes, while causing bleed damage at the same time. It was great. Aside from exploring the overworld, fighting the bosses was probably the most fun part of the game, especially Margit and Radahn. Unfortunately, the more unique and interesting ones are few and far between, as the optional dungeons recycle a lot of enemies as their bosses, making them a lot less satisfying to defeat. Speaking of recycling, this game also has the Elder Scrolls problem of reusing assets for each type of dungeon, with most of them feeling like clones of each other with repeated rooms, making it easy to get lost just because nothing in there looks distinct, and there's no map at all, except for the one for the overworld. After around 150 hours of exploring this world, I had to put the game on hiatus because it stopped being fun and became tedious and annoying, but that's mostly my own fault. I started this game in early December, meaning I was cutting it very close in order to finish it before making this video, and ultimately burnt me out. I'll probably go back to it at some point in the future, but I don't know when that will be, as 2023 is looking stacked. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. There's another, more important reason this game got tedious and annoying and made me want to quit. Technical problems on the PC version. When I first started the game, I could not get my controller to work properly with it, so I tried playing with keyboard and mouse, and damn, the controls are not only absolute aids, but some keys are not rebindable at all. Eventually I got my Switch Pro controller to work, but it would not register the trigger buttons unless I held down another button at the same time. I tried looking for a solution, but nothing worked, so I just dealt with it. It wasn't too bad to deal with, but it made some aspects like mounted and ranged combat very annoying. Aside from that, the open world aspect means the punishing combat will screw you over because of some terrain making you get stuck, unable to move and get surrounded and stun locked to death. Or how fall damage seems inconsistent, or the inconsistent input buffer system that makes you do things you don't intend while making other actions unresponsive. The game also has probably the worst targeting system I have ever dealt with in my life, with the camera hard locked to keep your enemy in the exact middle of the screen at all times, so moving around enemies causes the camera to jerk around in a dizzying way that makes you move in ways you don't intend. It also rarely targets the enemy you want when more than one is on the screen, and switching targets doesn't always get you the correct one, if it even works at all. The game does run fairly well most of the time, but also stutters a lot, and I had 10 game crashes. Fortunately, you don't lose a lot of progress when this happens, but it's still very annoying. Oh, and this game has multiplayer stuff, but I did none of that and played strictly offline, so yeah. This game is an honorable mention for my game of the year, mainly because I haven't finished it. There's a lot more I could say about it now, but maybe I will make a dedicated video about it in the future once I actually reach the end. If people want it, that is.
Smoldering with thy meager flame, cower in fear of the night. The hands of the fell omen shall brook thee no quarter.
If you've been following me on Twitter or Discord, you probably know what number 1 is. If not, you're probably going to laugh. I never expected my favorite game of the year to be so simple, because I'm always looking for things that are more complex and have a lot more going for them. Continuing the trend of what I played this year, this is yet another derivative pixel art game that came out of early access this year that takes inspiration from a classic series that I love and creates something completely different out of it. That's right, salty fanboys, my favorite game of the year is, in fact, Vampire Survivors. Sometimes the most simple thing can be the best thing. This game has almost no story, literally only uses the arrow keys in gameplay, while all of your attacks fire off automatically. It plays kind of like a single-player arcade game, perhaps most comparable to a bullet hell shooter game, but in this case, you are the bullet hell. Though it doesn't seem like it at first. You start out with a very basic weapon that can only hit a few enemies at a time, while you just control your character to avoid getting hit, and gain experience from the enemies you take out. Each time you level up, you get to choose from a selection of random weapons or support items or upgrades for the ones you already have. If you survive long enough, you'll see the weapons, items, and experience points you collect begin to snowball, and you turn into an absolute killing machine, taking out tons and tons of enemies at a time until the timer eventually runs out and death comes and blows out your anus in one shot.
Try to relax your anus!
But, all that said, you are actually very unlikely to make it even close to that point at first. After each round, you get to spend all the gold you earned on permanent upgrades that make your future runs even better, allowing you to get far enough to unlock the next stages, as well as unlocking new characters that have more powerful starting weapons and passive effects. This will build up massively over time, and eventually you'll be able to find a build that can actually kill death at the end, which unlocks even more things. And You can find special artifacts on stages that unlock an arcana system that makes you even more overpowered, the ability to strike weapons and items from the randomized lists, and tons of other secrets and modes that give the game an unbelievable amount of replayability. Once you get to the end game, it basically becomes a test to see how many kills you can rack up, with numbers that can push over the 100,000 mark in a 30-minute game, and it's quite amazing to see it all work without any technical issues other than understandable frame rate drops in the very late game when there are tons of damage calculations, particle effects, and enemy spawns and deaths going off every split second. I'm still using an old 1070, and it runs like a charm 99% of the time. And to top it all off, this game is only $5. You can't get a better value than this game, and the developers continue to add more content to it over time. The only real criticism this game deserves is that the sprites are pretty much obvious ripoff of Castlevania assets, but probably different enough not to get into trouble. Regardless, go get it. It's the perfect game to play while listening to podcasts or videos or something like that, so I ended up 100% completing it twice, so you can play it while watching my other videos on repeat or something, just saying. Actually, now that I think about it, you'd probably be playing this game longer than it would take for all of my videos combined. Oh well. And that's all for what came out in 2022. Here's a rapid fire of older games I played. Smash Ultimate, obviously. Roki, Eternal Radiance, Alwa's Collection, The Last Day of June, Blue Reflection Second Light, Age of Empires 4, Pokemon Shield, a game I can't talk about on YouTube, just saying. RimWorld, which probably would have been my #1 game if I included past games on the list. Banished, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, Momodora 1, 2, 3, and Reverie Under the Moonlight, Blossom Tales 1, a partial Skyrim revisit, and a replay of The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4, which I got the Platinum Trophy for. That concludes 2022. Kind of an underwhelming year for me, but 2023 is already looking like it will be stacked with interesting stuff. A new Neptunia game that isn't a shovelware spin-off for once, Atelier Ryza 3, which is looking like it has the potential to be the best game in the series, Hollow Knight Silksong, if it's actually coming out this time, Starfield, which I'm tepidly anticipating because Skyrim in space, bitches, a new SpongeBob platformer that actually looks fun, Final Fantasy 16 is interesting. Actually, never mind, that game doesn't exist until it's not a PS5 exclusive, just saying. But the two that will probably be going head to head for my Game of the Year are Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and The Legend of Heroes Trails into Reverie. Trails is a given for me, but we still know hardly anything about Zelda, so it's kind of a coin toss at this point. We'll see how it plays out. I'll still be keeping my expectations low, like always. Anyway, what were your favorite games of 2022? Do you agree or disagree with anything I've mentioned in the video? Did I interest you in a game you hadn't heard of before? Any games I missed that I should play? Post your thoughts in the comments below and I will reply. I want to start making more videos in general, so I'm thinking of making one each time I complete a game to highlight some of the interesting things from yesteryear that I don't get to talk about in these yearly videos. I also want to make more top 10s, so if you have an idea for that, sound off on it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and follow me on the Twatter. I also might make my own Discord server soon, so keep an eye out if you're interested in that. Have a fabulous new year, and as always, have high standards, low expectations.
That I want
your shoulders.